So there's been a lot going on around the world in recent days. It's been a turbulent few weeks. Arguably, it always is, but it does seem to be a particularly turbulent few weeks. There was, of course, a huge mudslide disaster in Colombia and Macoa. There are still recovering victims there. There is ongoing Brexit negotiations between Britain and the rest of the EU. Um, there are street protests in many parts of the world: Venezuela, South Africa. Um, there's contested elections in Ecuador. Um, there is a lot going on. But one thing that is emerging is the horrendous situation in Syria. Not that it wasn't horrendous already, of course it was, but in the latest atrocity, there has been a chemical strike, suspected chemical attack. I think at this point, based on the symptoms of the victims, I think everyone agrees that's what it is. So I'm just going to read out the Wikipedia article, introductory section of it anyway. Granted, it may not be the best source, but it is the most available one in terms of being relatively neutral. On the 4th of April 2017, the Tahrir al-Sham, formerly known as the al-Nusra Front, al-Qaeda's Syrian branch, controlled town of Khan Shakun in the Idlib governorate of Syria was struck by a heavy airstrike, followed by massive civilian chemical intoxication. The release of the toxic gas, likely sarin, killed at least 74 people, some sources are now saying 86, and injured more than 557, according to the Idlib Health Authority. If confirmed, the attack would be the deadliest use of chemical weapons in the Syrian civil war since the Ghouta chemical attack in 2013. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, as well as the UK Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, blamed the attack on the forces of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, while the Russian and Syrian governments said it was caused by the Syrian Air Force's destruction of a nearby rebel-operated chemical weapons warehouse. In response, the United States launched 59 cruise missiles at Sharat Air Base, which is suspected of being the source of the attack. Those missile attacks are said to have killed 7 Syrian military personnel, including a general. Okay, so I want to talk a bit about the situation and also the wider situation, not just of Syria, but of dictators in the context of Middle East conflicts. This is a very important thing. It looks like whatever way you look at this, the Syrian government is culpable. Now, even if you take their claim that they were targeting a rebel base, and this is supposedly an Al Qaeda held area, well, it's an Al Qaeda held area. Um, Even if you take that argument, then it shows irresponsible logistics on their part to bomb these facilities with the weapons that may have been held there. Now, whether their argument is they didn't know these chemical weapons were held there or whether they did, I'm more inclined to believe that it's the Syrian regime's long track record of punishing the civilian population in rebel held areas. It's a policy of collective punishment, something that they've been doing since the start of this war. And that's their track record. It is in all their statements. That is to say, in areas held by opposition forces, whether it be Islamist groups like Al Qaeda, the Al Nusra Front, ISIS, or other groups, it has been the position of this Ba'athist regime to collectively punish anyone in that area. So if you're a civilian, you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you're going to be punished. I think that is more plausible than, oh, we made a mistake. Because there's a long track record of this, barrel bombing areas that they know civilians are in. Um, Now, in terms of President Trump's position, it's very difficult, I think, to argue any moral case against the airstrikes. How can anyone rationally argue that there shouldn't be a harsh response to this, a hardline response? I will say that Mr. Trump's position has been somewhat hypocritical because only now is he seemingly taking a hardline response to Assad. Bear in mind, for months during the presidential election, Trump was openly endorsing some of the propaganda used by the regime. that they're just an embattled regime fighting terrorists. I mean, Trump was basically towing the same narrative as Russia is. At best, he would say, oh, we don't really know what's going on, but it does seem a little bit rich to now be blaming all of this on Obama, when Trump for so long has been playing the devil's advocate for Bashar Assad. Having said that, I do think it's the right approach. I don't think you can take a pacifist attitude to something like a chemical attack. That's different from, obviously, a full-scale ground invasion, which I think would be a very, very grave decision to make. Here's the thing. I really think Western countries have a war fatigue. And I'm not talking about in terms of experience of war directly, but in terms of being caught up with Middle East conflicts. And you could pinpoint it back to Iraq, but I think it goes even beyond that. I think the first Iraq invasion in 2003, as opposed to recent intervention, really escalated things. I think no one can honestly dispute that, whatever your opinions are. But I also think it's a mistake to take this view that we're going to be in a mess no matter what we do in the Middle East. By we, I'm talking about NATO countries. So let's just not get involved at all. I think that can be a mistake, because what happens then? Russia encroaches on the region. Russia builds a military presence, and it really, really weakens the position of the West in the region. But it also then leads to a situation where you get Russia, for example, propping up this appalling regime. And I really would challenge those who think that Russia, I mean, I've made this point many times. Whenever I've spoken about Syria, I've made this point that it is hugely misguided to try and see Russia as some sort of great saviour of the Syrian people. If that's your position, you don't know how the Syrian people feel, at least a good deal of them. Certainly those Syrians in government-held areas would say that they love Assad, and it may well be that they see Assad as the lesser of two evils. But this is an absolutely horrendous regime. And in terms of bringing a solution to the Syrian war, I think there is this narrative for those who understandably see the threat from the Islamist factions like ISIS. Nobody wants ISIS to take over Syria. But I don't think it's plausible that so long as Assad is president of Syria, this thing is going to not end. Because so long as he is president, there's going to be people who will not accept him as president. And it's understandable. Because this is a dictator who has murdered thousands of his own people. And anyone who wants to dispute that is either a completely naive person or they have an agenda. Like that so-called journalist, Eva Bartlett, who claimed to be independent, but she was basically a cheerleader for Assad. I wonder what her response to this is. But, if you listen to the RT narrative on this, RT has shamelessly promoted the Assad regime from day one, as has the Russian Foreign Ministry. They're basically interchangeable. And that's a cruel joke when you consider the things this regime has been doing from the start. Look at the behaviour of their secret police, the Shabiha, torturing civilians who were seen as dissidents, bombing civilians with barrel bombs, and in every chemical attack so far, the overwhelming evidence has pointed towards the Syrian regime. That doesn't mean that the Islamists aren't capable of it. It doesn't mean they're not capable of doing horrendous things. But I think it is more plausible when you have the regime, which is militarily on the upper hand, backed by a major power, Russia. It seems more plausible that they would have access to chemical stockpiles as opposed to Islamist factions. I think if Islamist factions had access to chemical stockpiles, do you not think they'd be using it on Western targets? Do you not think they would be shipping that to Western cities and trying to commit horrendous terrorist attacks with those sort of weapons. So I really, really take issue with anyone who wants to go down the line of saying, "Oh, this regime is innocent." And this ties into a wider point. There is a narrative, especially from, it's not just from left wing people, actually, it's often from right wingers who feel that having strong men in power, and not just in Syria, across the Middle East, let's say Assad, Salah in Yemen, and going back, Mubarak in Egypt, Gaddafi in Libya. Now, each of these strong men don't share the exact same ideology, but there is this idea that you keep a strong man in power, he reins in all the factions, and he kind of keeps it under check. It was the same argument used for Tito in Yugoslavia, i.e. when Tito died, Yugoslavia fell apart. It's something that is one of the strongest claims made in defense of authoritarian regimes. They keep warring factions in check. On one hand, this may be technically true. I mean, take Saddam, for instance. Saddam was a brutal dictator, but he wasn't necessarily a religious fanatic. However, I think that this narrative is very, very misguided, because I think that it's an artificial check and balance. It's an artificial security situation. I think the more brutal these dictators are, the more they torture civilians, the more they show iron hammer approach to any dissent, the more resentment builds. That's why Gaddafi died such a horrible death, because it was years of bitter resentment. And I'm not saying that was right or wrong, but the people who killed Gaddafi, yes, it was brutal the way he died, but Gaddafi was no saint. You know, his regime were guilty of some horrendous torture. And it could be argued that Bashar Assad is the world's biggest recruiter for ISIS, because his brutality is seen as a way to fuel the Islamist narrative. Now, in the case of Syria, their narrative wouldn't be it's the West is supporting this dictator. It's the Russians are supporting this dictator. It is somewhat surprising Russia hasn't so far been hit by a major ISIS attack until St. Petersburg last week. Whether that was directly inspired by ISIS or not, who knows? But the Islamist narrative is also that the West supports strong men. In this case, they would say the Saudi regime. So I really think it is a mistake to think that by keeping strong men in power or by propping up strong men, it keeps the Islamists in check. The best answer for the Middle East is a path to secular democracy. Now, this is another issue. There is this mentality, especially among right-wing circles, that, oh, the Arabs are wild people, they're savages. They'll automatically become Islamists if these strong men fall. I think that is hugely misguided, because it's assuming that all people in those societies are deeply religiously conservative. Certainly there are strong factions there, but in my opinion, that is a betrayal to secular and liberal factions in those countries. I mean, the Arab Spring wasn't about imposing Islamism. It was about legitimate grievances about unemployment, about corruption, about persecution. And it was similar in all the countries it affected. You know, the Syrian civil war didn't begin with an Islamist uprising against Assad. It began with a civic uprising. The actual spark of the war was those Syrian teenagers who were tortured by the regime. They weren't Islamists. What happens is Islamists then take advantage of the situation. That is why it's so essential that these dictators are pressured to reform. You know, the world is not a simple place, and there's never going to be a situation where it's as simple as, okay, well, the Western countries just send in the military forces and sort everything out. That is never going to happen smoothly. This precision airstrike on the Syrian government base, I think it's justified. If Trump then decided for a full ground invasion, I wouldn't be so sure about that. Having said that, Syria is about as hellish as it's possible to be, so I can't imagine anything making the situation worse than it already is. Here in Britain, May has taken a bit of a hands-off approach to this situation, certainly more hands-off than David Cameron took. Bit of history, back in 2013, David Cameron did push for airstrikes against the Assad regime. That didn't work because it got voted down in Parliament. Later, in about, I think it was 14 or 15, he pushed for airstrikes against ISIS. Now, those who continually churn out this line, the West created ISIS, firstly, I am still to see actual, tangible, hard evidence that as a foreign policy, either the Obama or Cameron administrations or Hollande administrations created ISIS. I think what is much more plausible is that ISIS took advantage of the situation and that because of the rogue arms industry, it's a very murky world, they got their hands on weapons that probably were being sent to moderate rebel factions. Of course, now that's almost a joke because most of the moderates have been pushed out. But I honestly think at best the West can be accused of naivety or short-sightedness in funding what they believe to be moderate rebels. But here's the thing. David Cameron, to his credit, did push for action against the Assad regime after the Ghouta chemical attack. I don't think anyone can accuse David Cameron of not trying to take action. Now, the Obama administration took a bit of a hands-off approach. I mean, it was a case of we'll have a red line. Then the Democrats and the Obama administration were ridiculed by the Republican side for not acting on that when Assad clearly did cross a red line. I really don't know what is the answer to Syria, but I will say this. Anyone who thinks that it's going to be a future with Assad at the top, at the very, very least, there needs to be some sort of condition for Assad to remain at the top. The only people that back Assad is Russia and Iran. Many, many, many Syrians detest Assad as much as they detest ISIS. In some cases more so. The Assad regime has actually killed more civilians than ISIS has. Now, ISIS is a vicious death cult, no question about it. But they are, in the end of the day, a terrorist organization. They're not an organized army. The situation in Iraq is a bit different because in that situation there are moral questions about American airstrikes, which are purported to have caused heavy civilian casualties. Again, the whole hearts and minds argument, well, if you're an Iraqi farmer and you've seen your entire family wiped out in an American airstrike, you're not exactly going to be very endearing towards Uncle Sam. And you may well find yourself looking at other sources. Is the misfactions. This is the sad reality that where you have civilian deaths, it is the biggest recruiting tool for terrorism. In no way should that be read as apologism for terrorism. ISIS are the scum of the earth. They're a vicious death cult. And I think they should be, the more of their leaders who die, the better. But it shouldn't be a case of either choose a brutal dictator or choose a vicious terrorist organization. I utterly reject the narrative that it has to be one or the other. Russia has decided it's one or the other. Russia chose the brutal dictator. I think when history is written, neither side will come out particularly well, neither the West or Russia. But I do think that Russia will be on record as having supported a murderous dictatorship. The West will be on record as having perhaps an inconsistent record. But in terms of the West created ISIS, the people who churn that line out, All I want to see is hard evidence for that. I don't want to see conspiracy theories. I don't want to see utterly biased RT sources, which, as far as I'm concerned, are illegitimate because they're basically the mouthpiece of the Russian foreign ministry. I don't take journalists, so-called independent journalists like Eva Bartlett, to be legitimate, credible people because she is not independent. She is an Assad supporter. You cannot take so blatantly one side in the conflict then claim to be independent. It's nonsensical. That would be like deciding to back ISIS and claiming that you're independent. Give me a break. Um, so there's no easy answers. And when it comes to morality in the Middle East, again, I don't think any of the big powers are innocent. I think the West has blood on its hands for supporting the Saudi regime and what they're doing in Yemen. Yemen has largely been overlooked, actually, and that is a horrible situation. Now, could we really blame Yemeni civilians for hating the West? Because what they see is the West arming their powerful neighbour who's been bombing them to smithereens. So, unfortunately, when it comes to the Middle East, nobody is innocent. But in terms of reaching a solution, I really don't know. There are no easy answers. I do think, though, that if Assad is to stay in power, at the moment it looks like the government forces, aided by Russia, are winning this conflict. Whether Trump's intervention is going to make a difference or not, I don't know. I mean, this airstrike on the military base was relatively small scale compared to the atrocities the Assad regime has been committing. If Trump decides to go for a full-scale military offensive against Syrian government bases, inevitably there is going to be Russian personnel killed. It could get to a very, very dangerous situation where it's an outright confrontation between Russia and the West. That would certainly change the situation of Trump's alleged ties to Russia. Um, that could potentially be a very dangerous situation. Trump has also taken a very hard line on North Korea, and I don't want to go too far off on a tangent, but that is also significant. Of course, Donald Trump is meeting Xi Jinping as I speak. This chemical attack is going to overshadow that somewhat. China's taken a bit of a hands-off approach to Middle Eastern issues, but again, China won't be a great fan of seeing regime change because, Beijing is an authoritarian regime as well. Not anywhere near as bad, I might add, as the Assad regime. The Chinese government isn't dropping barrel bombs on Chinese civilians, but it is an authoritarian regime. The Chinese, as a policy matter, are always wary of regime change. Um, there are some things I'm convinced that we cannot do. We cannot, tempting as it is, go down the lines of the Middle East is a mess, let's just stay out of it. It's very tempting, but I think the problem with that would be Russia would then get a hold on the region, and in the long run, it would weaken Western governments geopolitically. I don't think that's an option for a wide range of reasons. Number two, I think it is wrong to assume that strong men automatically keep a country in balance. On the surface, that can certainly appear to be the case. But every time they torture someone, every time they erode basic civil liberties, all that does is breed resentment. And not just among Islamists, among seculars, among those, among everyone. You ask a Syrian secularist, a Syrian moderate, what would you choose between Assad and ISIS? The chances are they will say neither. And that to me is very telling. If Assad does stay in power, that is, if the government side appears to be winning this conflict, it has to be, I think, there would have to be some sort of compromise, some sort of power sharing. Could it be that Syria, the only solution to this crisis is partition? I don't know if that's even an option, because if it goes down the line of partitionism, then you get a situation where you basically sell an entire chunk of land, which would then presumably become a new independent state, to a vicious Islamist death cult. And I think that would be unthinkable, because then you would have this vicious Islamist death cult then forming a government. and you would have another Afghanistan as the Taliban controlled it. But the narrative that we need to keep strong men in power to keep out Islamists, I think it is hugely misguided. I mean, that was the rationale in so many situations, and then look what happened. There was Arab Spring, and it just breeds resentment as well among the people because they see Western governments supporting these regimes. We need to be consistent, and it is difficult. I can't see it changing anytime soon. When Theresa May shakes hands with powerful Gulf leaders, when Donald Trump shakes hands with Sisi, I'm not naive. I don't think you're going to have a situation where there's a completely liberal democratic government in place probably anywhere in the Middle East, except arguably Israel. But at the very least, there needs to be some basic demands from Western governments. If we support you, you cannot have a situation where people are tortured. You cannot have a situation where people are not given a fair trial, etc., etc. And I'll leave it there. There really isn't much more to say because the situation is horribly complex. I don't know all the answers. But I'm adamant that it shouldn't be a case of one versus the other. Either back a bloody dictatorship or back a bloody Islamist organisation. And to be fair, I think that David Cameron tried to get the balance right. I really do. I will defend Cameron for that because I believe he tried his level best to get the balance right. In the end of the day, there's going to be people who criticise the Western position no matter what. I do question those who have a blame the West first mindset. I really do. We unquestionably have made mistakes. We unquestionably have blood on our hands. We unquestionably cannot claim total moral superiority. But those who want to blame the West for everything are simply not looking at how difficult this situation is. And they're not looking at the fact that no matter what position we take, there will be a counter argument to it. Decisiveness is important, and for that reason, I think Trump's airstrike is going to be seen as an important move. I mean, to be clear, this was an airstrike on a military compound, no civilian deaths. That can't be said for Mosul. Trump has to be very careful in both Iraq and Yemen, where there's also been civilian fatalities from US-led airstrikes, that he isn't just creating more jihadists, because it's building up resentment. Right, this has been a long video, but there has been a lot to cover. Let me know your thoughts. What do you think the answer to Syria is? But if you're going to come out and just blame the West for everything, I'm going to challenge that position because I think it's misguided. Just for the record, I'm not saying Russia's responsible for everything. I'm not saying that it's entirely one-sided. But I do think Russia's arguments that they've got moral high ground, and the idiots who follow RT and think that Russia has moral high ground, they're kidding themselves. Just to be clear, Russia hasn't tried to be neutral. Russia has shamelessly, unreservedly, unhesitantly supported a murderous regime that's killing its own people. Not that Russia gave a great deal of thought about its operations in Chechnya. Okay, I'll leave it there. Let me know your thoughts.